I propose to start with some broad propositions on the DOFs, we call it DOFs here for short, and also to explore the landscape and the ecosystem in which this issue has arisen for us to discuss. And then I'll come down to each of the specific submissions for each of you, right? That's what I propose to do. All of you would be content providers. You understand the term? Yes, you are. One is a journalist, I heard you say. One's a former editor. One's a current editor. And I think, Mr. Ngiam, you also produce content for publication, correct?
On behalf of Maruah, yes, that's correct.
Yes. Yes.
Could I request that when you speak to ensure the microphone is on for recording purposes? Thank you.
As content providers, you would have occasion to use social media like Facebook to transmit that content for your readers, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
In fact, that would be the main way in which you would transmit and broadcast your content or publish it.
Yes. Not all, because we do transmit through apps, mobile apps, and people do go on the site itself. So it's not the only way, but it's a main distribution channel.
The main distribution channel will be social media sites, followed by your own online
site,
platforms.
then followed by mobile apps and such.
All right,
yeah.
Thank you. Now, what I'd like to do is to take a leaf out of my colleague's book as well, is to give you a sense of the kind of submissions that have been made to us over the past 5 or 6 day hearing, which have taken place over the last 2 weeks, just to give you a sense of what has been said, and then frame some of the issues for you to consider in the context of the landscape and issues we are faced with. All right? So I'd like to start with looking at a couple of tables. If you will see them on the screen shortly. Yes. So what I've done is, these tables have been shown to several other witnesses before. I think you may have seen as well when you sat behind. But they summarize the evidence given by each of these representatives, and the transcript and relevant references are there. So I'll just quickly take you through it. So on issues of national security, and this is in the context of DOFs, there is a prevalence of disinformation campaigns that one has seen around the world. They threaten a state's national security, sovereignty. They are an established part of a military arsenal, just as important as conventional kinetic warfare. If you go to page 2, Dr. Michael Raska says that it is a persistent, permanent effort, takes place all the time, and it occurs even in the absence of open conflict. Page 3, why such a method is an attractive option is because the costs and manpower needed for this would be disproportionately low. Page 4, there is also, as also in your case, an increased reliance on internet and social media as the primary source of news and information, which renders them ideal vectors for an information attack. Over the page are some interesting examples of how easy and how inexpensive it would be to manipulate votes online, to buy click farm services, to engage in bot activity, to buy Instagram likes, and also to buy other social media likes like WeChat and so on. Dr. Michael Raska has told us that state actors use this as asymmetric warfare, including disinformation campaigns, to create a situation in which a target state makes a decision leading to its own defeat. Dr. Janice Berzins has said that information and psychological wars are conducted to reduce the morale of an enemy's armed forces and civilian population. And that's why we are told very often you find that the target medium focuses on race, religious, and other social fault lines. Over the page 7, that these unconventional warfare methods reside in our system long before it is detected. They're deployed long in advance. Dr. Shashi Jayakumar told us that. Over the page at 8, civilian and domestic proxies are often used in the target country. And the reason for that, obviously, is a falsehood could emanate from overseas. But given the nature of the internet, the fact that it is transboundary, the majority of these disinformation narratives can usually be transmitted by domestic proxies who either draw from or share or use inspiration from abroad. Dr. Gulizar has said that civilians may be involved in disinformation campaigns, knowingly or otherwise, as circulators, as part of the militia, and also by carrying out these cyber attacks. Dr. Ben Nemo has said that disinformation operators try and infiltrate the target population by interacting with genuine members of the community. In other words, coming in, infiltrating into social media networks, befriending, and being part of the genuine community online, and then try and build up a following in that group. They will then be able to insert their bias or false information into that group in order to influence and steer a particular political direction. At page 10, a perfectly thriving state can, in a matter of months, be transformed into an arena of armed conflict, sometimes a victim of foreign intervention, and sink into a web of chaos and civil war. Page 11, Dr. Ben Nemo again, he says, even if a small group doesn't have the capability to create its own botnet, it can easily rent a botnet for occasion and use that to influence outcomes. There's a proliferation of commercial activity, and the most recent example being Cambridge Analytica, which no doubt you would have heard. There's significant and serious impact of such disinformation campaigns. They do have consequences in the real world and influence events in real time. This drives narratives, creates cognitive effects in which online behavior has offline consequences and vice versa. The aim of this, at page 14, is to weaken, destabilize target societies psychologically and overall reduce the will to fight. How they work, as I mentioned earlier, they try to sow discord, destroy trust, focusing on community groups, deepen fractures, exploit tensions by working at groups at both ends of the spectrum and pushing them further apart, leveraging and amplifying existing societal fault lines, but also creating new ones potentially. Page 17, between communities, sowing distrust between government and key institutions like the police, religious institutions, erode trust in key government institutions like the police, like emergency services, or key state organs like the judiciary. What we've learned from the Russian campaigns include the effect of polarizing the elite and society, causing or inciting mass panic with loss of confidence in key government institutions. They generate distrust against the police, which is a highly trusted institution in Singapore, and incidents have generated fear and distrust. The falsehoods have also reduced trust between the citizens. And at page 20, bring it closer to home in Singapore. Some of our representatives have told us that Singapore is a sandbox for subversion, and it would be mistaken to assume that it is not already happening here. Finally, page 22, Dr. Michael Raska says, we are an attractive target for cyber warfare. We have potential, or built-in potential, for being divided along racial lines, religious lines, and nationalistic ones as well. Just want to pause for a moment and ask if you would disagree with that.
I think this catalog of various, I should say, misdeeds are actually covered by existing laws already.
That's not my question. I said, would you disagree with the views?
No, that's I'm prefacing and answer is yes. These things are possible, and they all definitely would be illegal under existing law.
Yes, I've not focused on laws. I'm not asking any questions on laws yet. So you would agree with the broad propositions I've outlined from these witnesses?
I mean, the specific cases that are given, we can't really tell because we don't know the facts, or if in fact it's how should I say, undercover operations, we may never know. But certainly there's evidence in the past of countries have carried this out.
Yes.
And it was certainly illegal whenever it took place, whether 19th century or 1950 or today.
Just so I'm clear, if at any time any of you disagree with the comments or disagree with each other, please say so, all right? Anything from Mr. Shih or Ms. Han?
Sorry, could you, is it possible to relook at the table, the last page?
I'll just leave the table up
Oh,
there.
Okay. The part where it says about the attacks on the trust on policing, a religious judiciary. Who said that? I think it was so undermine the support. I would say, yeah, I agree with this. I generally agree with the comments, but this particular, I think my view is there might be might not be, let's say, in cases where deliberately attacking, but more bring out the gaps in which trust could be further built by having more transparency. Because if the concern that's being raised is about transparency of operation and how the government agencies act, I don't think that can be considered as a deliberate attack.
Well,
so I think that should be a difference. So in general, I do agree, but on some areas, I think you need to be more specific. Yeah.
We are talking about something that is falsehood and deliberate. So in that context, you would agree?
Again, I think it would depend on what is defined as falsehoods. Yeah, I because at this point, when it's given to me as such falsehood, based on the past few days of definition of falsehood, I can't really agree based on that definition. But in general, I do agree that public trust has to be cultivated in our public institution, and it's important that the public has utmost trust. But similarly importantly, there needs to be transparency being given. I think respect needs to be both sides.
And it would be highly damaging to our civil society if that trust is eroded.
Yes, that's correct. I agree.
Right. Yeah. And we are talking about falsehoods in the sense that it's something that's not true.
You see, I find it hard to agree straightforward because sorry, I'm going to shift it. Yeah, because based on previous hearings, Dr. Janelle mentioned on, say, facts that are not backed by the government or the state, or facts or not, as in not having the states to participate.
No, I'm sorry. That's not what I said.
I believe it because I quoted you specifically. I wrote that.
There can be no basis for saying that anything, as long as it's backed by the government, is automatically true. I don't think.
No.
That's not what I said.
Anything that's not backed is a falsehood.
That's not what I said.
That is even more.
That is not what I said. If you can point me to the point at which I said that, please do so. But I did not say that.
The hearing in which you're speaking to SPH and Media Corp.
I did not say that in that speech, nor that hearing.
Okay, I stand corrected, but but
we haven't reached that stage.
Okay, sure, no worries. But based on my perception of the falsehood that is being defined, I can't agree on. I can't give my consensus of on that yet. Yeah.
Okay, we'll come to that.
Yeah, sure, no, thanks.
We'll come to that.
To answer Mr. Tong's question, if we could go back to the table. And right at the bottom, I would agree that these are, with the general feedback that these are some potential harms that could come from deliberate online falsehoods. But as with Dr. George before us, I'm not an expert on national security or cyber security. I cannot say whether I agree or not to assertions like Singapore is a sandbox for subversion, or we are an attractive target for cyber warfare. I believe there might be some contention among the experts in that field as well, and so I wouldn't want to say if I agree. I wouldn't stand by some of this since I don't have the expertise.
Okay. Say for those comments, you feel it's a reasonable set of views from our previous representative?
I would agree that generally these are some potential harms that could come out of.
Right. Let me maybe move away from that table a bit and show you a report that is very recently published. I'll have it on screen as well, so you can all look at it at the same time. It's a report from the Canadian Security Intelligence Service And the title of the report is The Security Challenges of Modern Disinformation. You can see that on the page. It's a long report. I'll just like to show you parts of the executive summary that appears from page 7 onwards. So you see from the opening paragraph of the executive summary that it says, the reach and speed of the internet and social media have escalated the potential impact of disinformation. I guess as a statement, you won't disagree with that, correct? You have to articulate so that...
I do agree with that.
And you see, it goes on to say that increases in data transmission capacity coupled with a shift towards pragmatic advertising have resulted in precipitous decrease in the ability of traditional journalism to mediate the quality of public information. Skipping a few lines down, within that torrent is a current of lies and distortions that threaten the integrity of public discourse, debate, and democracy. And under the heading Agents of Disinformation, you'll see there's several actors pointed out here. Some examples of how the falsehoods are amplified include the use of an extensive network of internet trolls, bot networks, use of state-controlled media outlets like Russia Today or Sputnik, both of which were the subject of some discussion and evidence before us previously. Second bullet point, using Facebook, Twitter, and other channels to propagate this, to create a false story and make sure it reaches a segment population likely to be influenced by these social media platforms. The use of forged documents, phony experts, doctored photos, videos. Anyone who challenges the lies then becomes a target for high-volume online vilification. You would agree that there is no space for this kind of activity in our online landscape?
I think I'll definitely
Sorry,
agree
is it
with
okay if I...
Switch off.
Hello, sorry.
Can't see him.
Oh.
Yes.
Yes, I just thought I'd make a point. I mean, Mr. Tong asked whether we do agree with there's no space for such discourses, I guess, in our society. I think the point that we need to be fairly clear here is that a lot of the instances that these various experts have pointed out in the span of the hearing relate specifically to cybersecurity. I think I share with the rest of the people in this panel that to some extent we're out of our depth here in terms of how we can address issues of cybersecurity. On the point of misinformation or disinformation, my sense then would be that whether this has some degree of latitude in our society, or for that matter in any society, very much depends on what is it that we define as disinformation or misinformation. Because what I can see so far, I mean, based on many days of following the hearing, is that there's a wide diversity of views in terms of how exactly we define what misinformation or disinformation is. We have cybersecurity issues on one hand. Potentially, I believe a few other experts have also brought up issues about hacking. And how exactly we define this,
Mr.
I think...
Can I just stop you there by just going back to the point? I think
sure.
Maybe I defined the question like I did when I first asked it. I'm talking about use of false stories, and to read from this paragraph, the use of phony experts, forged documents, doctored photos and videos, and anyone who then challenges it becomes a target for high-volume online vilification. And this is the document from a very recent document from the Canadian Security Unit. I'm simply asking whether you will see any role for any of this in our online space.
So you're referring to the kind of information that is being...
No, I'm referring to what I've just said. Forged documents, doctored photos, fake videos, false stories.
So in effect, you're talking about the content that is being circulated, is it?
Using these methods of falsity.
My point would be that the content itself really should not be used. As to the intention of why they're using it. I think that we can take up separately.
Yes, Mr. Lee, it's a separate matter. I think what I'm focused on, just to make sure that we draw the parameters clearly, is that I think I would certainly not accept any of this as being something we should peddle on our online space. And I'm just trying to get this panel's agreement on that.
I would say that these should be debunked, and definitely there should be a response, but I would urge that it be most a non-legal response and that we should not have new laws simply to censor this content. That's not to say that we leave them alone, but they should be responded to.
Yes, so I think the starting premise is that they need to be responded to. The method by which you choose that response is something we can talk about.
Yes, that would be key.
Sure, yes.
Right, thank you. I'd just like to go back to the document. It goes on to talk about the Russian, Chinese, and Philippine campaigns. Just quickly cast your eye over it, you'll see that they've just outlined some methods by which the actors in those jurisdictions conduct their activity. So it's a mix of using exploitable divisions in target audiences, pushing a nationalist agenda more than an ideological one, targeting a population. Chinese use domestic cyber fortresses. The messages projected domestically and globally are both nationalistic and ideological. The Russian disinformation machinery is explicitly weaponized as a resource for future wars, weakening a target country's sense of danger and diminishing the will to resist. Over the page, you'll see that in the second bullet point from the top, during the Brexit campaign, large number of Twitter accounts were active, particularly on the Leave side, but most then disappeared immediately after the vote, strongly indicating that they were driven by bots. They reflected the hyper-partisan and simplistic style of the British tabloid press. In addition, there have also been independent emergent activists. You'll see that in the paragraph that follows. The paragraph at the bottom deals with agents of disinformation, who are the enablers, and it talks about information ecosystem enabling large-scale disinformation campaigns. False news spread in many ways, but Facebook and Twitter are especially important tools used to target specific population segments. Individuals accept the false news as credible or useful and spread it further. State agencies make extensive use of bots and phony accounts to popularize false news stories and spread them in cascading volumes impossible for human actors to produce or vet individually. Social media companies have become increasingly aware of their role in this problem, but not all of their leaders are convinced of their responsibility to eliminate such false news. Finally, under the Russian disinformation messages, you'll see that they've adjusted to circumstances and state objectives, but they remain very persistent major themes, according to which, for example, Western governments are fascists, or world leaders represent a powerful elite disdainful of and acting against ordinary people. All of these themes are added to the specific support themes which arise, for example, in the 2016 US elections. And then reactions that you'll see, summarized by the Canadian paper here, that multiple actors and agencies working to counter and defend against this threat. Governments are increasingly insisting that social media companies take responsibility for the content they facilitate. European legislators are ahead of those in the US. Some governments have moved to block known disinformation media streams in their countries, shielding their citizens from attempts at foreign influence. Over the page, under the outlook, last paragraph, disinformation poisons public debate and is a threat to democracy. Raised public awareness is needed to distinguish the real from false. There are many ways for governments and organizations to counter the threat, but there's no guarantee that even effective counter campaigns can defeat the high volume of malicious communications. In broad terms, that's the landscape that the Deliberate Online Falsehood operates within. Would you accept?
Yes.
And
yes, I agree.
Yes. I think if you all agree with each other, then I would take it that one yes would be sufficient so that we can move on. All right. And one then has to look at how we tackle these doffs in the context of a landscape such as that sketched out by this Canadian paper. Would you agree? Anyone will do.
Sorry, can you repeat your question again?
Yes. That when one has to, when we look at how we tackle and deal with the doffs, one has to look at it in the context of the landscape as sketched out by the Canadian paper here.
I agree. It's situational. Yeah.
And we also have to apply that situational context to where we are in Singapore, correct?
Yes.
Now, in Singapore, we've heard many representatives tell us that we are special, but also particularly vulnerable because of our diverse racial, religious, cultural background. I think you would accept that.
I don't think I would stand by saying that we are especially vulnerable, but as mentioned before, I don't have the same expertise as national security experts.
My stance is I do agree that with our diverse society, we do seem to be susceptible to such attacks. But then because of our education of how society develop, such attacks is pretty tough for the conventional methods mentioned by the other experts to take place. Yeah.
Let's look at a couple of other pieces of evidence from the previous representatives, and I'll show you some online papers, and then maybe invite your further views on this, okay? Now, if you look at the next table I have, it's on examples of falsehoods relating to race and religion. Again, it'll come up on the screen shortly. So Dr. Carol Soon, I think, is a name you probably would be familiar with. She's given the example of the online doctored video of Ahok and his allegedly anti-Islam speech, which went viral very quickly. Rumors that he was backed by a party linked to China, and that led to hundreds of thousands of Muslims protesting against Ahok and demanding his arrest. And she cited this as an example of how sensitive an issue like race and religion would be in a country like Indonesia, and what impact it had on the elections. She also talked about, well, different representatives spoke about the 2012 and 2014 Indonesian elections focusing on Jokowi's Javanese Muslim identity and online information that seeks to bring that into question. Dr. Ben Nemo over the page in the US talks about falsehoods that were used to exacerbate the distrust between African Americans and the police force, using Twitter and Facebook accounts. And you would have heard of the Black Lives Matter campaign and the impact that has had on views of the police in America, as well as the distrust between particularly the African Americans and the police. In Ukraine, at page 3, the Russian disinformation campaign has sought to divide the Russian-speaking Ukrainians and the Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians, to split and divide the country. And that comes from someone who is a co-founder of stopfake.org. Closer to home, 2015, there was a fabricated article about how a Filipino family had disrupted a 2015 Thaipusam procession, telling local Indians to stop playing the drums because the loud noise was making the child cry. But that turned out to be completely untrue because there's no such complaint. Would you accept that much of the falsehoods, to the extent that they're seeking to target a particular audience, to divide and to undermine social cohesion, would ride along the lines of issues such as race, religion, culture? Fair statement?
I mean, many false such, I should say, using race, religion, and so on is a common political tactic. That's certainly true. Both, I mean, it's been true for hundreds of years, so still true today.
Yes, and now with the online presence, with the information superhighways that is Google and Facebook, that's something that is being accentuated and proliferated. Would you accept?
The speed, I don't know, the only difference is the speed. Whether it's more or less than before, I don't know. But the speed of the internet also allows the countervailing forces to react faster. So it's that both factors could be involved.
Yes, you would accept that?
I agree with the representative from Maruah, what he said. The dynamics has not changed over the centuries, the decade, millennium. The race and religion is something that's really sensitive. And with the modern technology, people can transmit those so-called seditious ideas or comments more rapidly. But then similarly, counter arguments or comments can be made together. Like example, the mention of the TRS article that was published in actually, I'm not too sure. Okay, but in any case, when the article was first published, within I think a few hours, my publication published another so-called narrative of what actually happened, and in fact was testified in court that the eyewitness shared the article and said that what the defunct TRS written was actually not true. A lot of the commenters went to the outside and got to know that it was actually not true.
Yes, but you saw the Canadian paper explain that all of these falsehoods, spreading stories, false stories on racial and religious lines, are then accentuated by bots, trolls, which multiply the effect significantly. Wouldn't you agree?
I did try to procure a bot myself. It's pretty. I think at this point it's pretty hard to mimic a human being. What it does is simply copy and pasting messages and stuff. So with that, I think it's very easy to debunk what the message is trying to say, to perpetuate, because government authoritative bodies or the media could easily crush the rumors.
I'll get to some examples of how bots have been used quite effectively. Okay? But before that, just one last table to deal with some other evidence given in the course of the last 2 weeks. And this deals with the impact of DOFs. Yes. So some of them you've seen before, but I think you'll see first page, Dr. Michael Raska's evidence that DOFs aim to weaken and destabilize target societies psychologically. Over the page, communities are pitted against each other. The destabilization of the Ukrainians we've seen before. The experience in Europe, Dr. Heglich and Dr. Muteza gave us evidence of that, what has become of disinformation campaigns against the migrants. And over the page, Dr. Nugroho, founder and chairman of Mafindo in Indonesia, says disinformation can cause serious violence and gave an example which is quite graphic. Trust in institutions can be eroded through deliberate online falsehoods. The head of Kremlin Watch and Dr. Shashik Jayakumar has said that as well. Trust in police eroded. You asked me about that earlier. This is from Dr. Ben Nemo, as well as closer to home, Dr. Damon Chong, who is a research fellow at RSIS, and in particular using the social media platform to proliferate false stories about African Americans being targeted by the police had some significant effect when the Black Lives Matter campaign went on. The spreading of misinformation, which corrodes democracy. Public figures are often targeted by their racial and religious identity. Falsehoods then make them seem to work against people. In other words, portraying a false image and picture of these public figures. At page 8, such falsehoods seek to entrench existing views. So, for example, the refugee debate in Germany was influenced significantly by this. And Dr. Carol Soon says that many people are then pushed to either extreme, when that view may not have been what they might have been held if left to their own, safe for what has been propagated online in the form of these DOFs. Now, you asked me about some examples. Let me just take you to it. But before that, frame the issue in this way. DOFs are online falsehood, deliberate falsehoods. There is a spectrum between that and truth. You would agree? So you have truth on one hand, you have falsehoods on the other. Closer to the truth side, you will have opinions based on truth, you have misimpressions, you have mistakes, you have misinterpretation, misrepresentation, and then falsehood. So there's a spectrum. You would accept?
Yes, and that spectrum is key to today's discussion.
Yes. And I think what you will want to say is that one must have a differentiated response or a variegated response to what you might find on that spectrum.
Not just a different response, but also concern over who gets to decide what lies where on the spectrum.
Yes. The need to eradicate deliberate online falsehoods in the form that I've outlined to you using the definition in the Canadian paper, you would have no difficulty with. So on one end of the spectrum, we would all agree that something must be done to remove this from, as far as possible, from our online landscape, correct?
Sorry, if I may speak.
I would actually disagree with that. Sorry, Ngiam, you were saying something? No,
just go ahead,
I'll just
Jordan.
point out that actually...
Yeah, let Mr. Shih
yes,
speak first.
No.
Okay.
Okay, never mind. Sorry. So I'll just go first. Then, yes, as I was saying, gosh, now I lost my train of thought. I think you talked about eradicating falsehoods. I think that might be a bit too strong a word. We certainly must challenge falsehoods. Eradicating them is a bit different.
That steps must be taken to deal with these falsehoods. And in some cases, you will need to remove them. In some cases, you need to correct them with true information. In some cases, you do a combination of that.
Yeah, that's probably true. Although, of course, before we can do any of that, you also have to determine truth or falsehood, which, as you know, is also can be debatable.
For speaking for myself, believe that there should really only be one truth.
Unfortunately, truth can change over time.
No, I mean, especially when you're dealing with a set of facts, there can only be one set of facts.
Even received scientific wisdom changes over time. So
No, I'm not talking about scientific wisdom. I'm saying factual position. There can only be one set of facts.
But how those facts are presented?
Let me give you a set of examples which might help. Let's say we have an altered video of President Obama criticizing all Christians. Or as you had a video of Ahok, altered video, fake video, criticizing all Muslims, Islam. Do you think there are two sets of facts or only one set of fact?
And the fact that's being put forward is that, say, Obama made certain statements. So if that is...
There is a video with words put into his mouth, which is possible now with technology. So if you listen to the video, he is criticizing Muslims. Likewise, you had a real case of Ahok, altered video, attacking Muslims. Do you think there are shades of truth in that?
The specific cases that you mentioned, no.
Okay, let me give you another example. A suggestion that President Jokowi is Christian. Do you think that shades of truth in that?
This is where the spectrum comes in. So such things that are clearly false and could be debunked would be on one end of the spectrum as a clear falsehood.
The question is, are there shades of truth in such a statement?
Not in this case, but unfortunately, content is not always this clear.
So I think in this discussion, it's good to keep in mind, we are talking about factual falsehoods. I think you have a legitimate point in saying, how do we define falsehoods? And are there, at the margins, some areas where there can be some disagreements? But let's keep to conceptually clear definitions first. We are talking about factual falsehoods. We are not talking about opinions. For example, you take a table, there can be shades of opinion as to whether it is a nice table, whether it's a bad table, whether it's a useful table, not a useful table. We are not talking about opinions. We are not talking about comments. We are talking about facts. So let's stick to that. I mean, you've got to be conceptually clear. That is what we are dealing with here. And in any such thing, of course, then there must be a mechanism to identify what is true and what is false factually. Okay? So I don't think we are talking about that yet. So today, at this stage, the question is simply, if something is clearly false, in the way that I've told you, Hillary Clinton is selling arms to ISIS, or she is running a pedophile ring. All of this has been put forward and believed by a number of people. or the ad hoc examples that I gave you, or the President Obama, there was an actual video, but it was an experiment done by a university. So sticking to that, is there a place for those in the framework of speech? And I think the specific question is, these sorts of falsehoods, conceptually now, leaving aside the question of whether how we come to decide on their falsity. Conceptually, once, false, true, if it is false, do you need to deal with it? I think that is the angle that's being explored right now.
I think if it's false
If I may,
and causes
interject right now.
One person.
Okay, I'll give way to you, John.
If I may interject right now, I know, Law Minister, you are not preferential towards debating on philosophical issues, but I think we do need to point out that there is a difference
I am actually
between
talking
what is
about a
factual.
philosophical issue. I am talking about a conceptual issue. So
that's very good. Yeah.
So let's
if
let's
that's
not
the case,
have
then
those, I think let's deal with the conceptual issue.
Sure.
True and false.
Okay, that's.
And if it is false, should we deal with it?
If that's the case, then I think I do need to point out first and foremost that there is a difference between what is factual and what is truth, because while there can be there can be various facts, and I think there's no disputing that something that is not factual should not be that case. But truth is often an interpretation of various facts that are put together. So I think we do need to make that distinction.
Go back to, let's say.
I think we use it to take
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, if I may clarify again, I think you asked whether we want to take action against falsehoods. So we may want to take action against falsehoods which cause harm. So the question, of course, what's the threshold for causing harm to society or to an individual? And ironically, sometimes we even take action against truths which are harmful. So that's another point to look at.
Could I also seek clarification then that the committee's definition of falsehood would come down to that narrow definition of something that is demonstrably not factual and wrong in the kind of Jokowi is a Christian sort of clearly false statements, and that's it?
I think there are different issues here. First, the conceptual point, true and false. I think that's clear. Our terms of reference are to deal with falsehoods. And certainly the way we are proceeding, thinking about, and panel members can disagree if they is we are not looking at, say, opinions which are unreasonable, for example. The facts may be true, but the opinion may be something that a very, very small minority, maybe 1 out of 1,000 might agree with. I don't think we are looking at opinions. For example, we are looking at facts. Then there are shades in terms of how you process this. How do you determine the truth versus what is false? And I did hear how Mr. Lee talking about there can be shades of truth. I think there is no point debating that point. I think we just leave it. I think different people can have different views as to whether there can be shades of truth. True, false. Following from that, taking into account the speed with which the internet moves, and sometimes you need to deal with it immediately. There has been some evidence given to the committee about whether how do you deal with something that is said to be false, whether you go and deal with it first and then determine whether it is true or false later, or whether you deal with it upfront, in which case it might take some time, and you weigh the consequences, the damage, and so on. I mean, those are issues which I think it's too premature for us to take a view on. Conceptually, in terms of our terms of reference, we are looking at falsehoods. what the kind of examples Mr. Tong has put forward, the kind of examples I've talked about. And we had a law professors who said to us what certainly I know and what the lawyers will know, which is that what is true and what is false is something that gets determined in court pretty much every day. That's the lifeblood of lawyers. So that has to be, something that is got to be dealt with. So should we deal with falsehoods? I think that's a question that's being discussed right now. And if so, how? How do you determine truth and false? I don't think those questions have been asked. They have been asked of other witnesses. And then the process, how should the process be? And what sort of speed with which we should move? And what comes first, what comes later? Those are issues that need to be thought through. I don't think Mr. Tong has been exploring those. Yeah, I hope that's clear.
Yep. So I do agree, examples such as the Djokovic and Ahok case, it's undeniable that such falsehood is unacceptable, undesirable, and detrimental to democracy. But the thing is, the two examples could be promptly proved to be untrue once the individuals come out to disprove that this is the case. But let's we go back in time and look at the weapon of mass destruction that is supposed to be in Iraq.